All right, here we go, everyone. Welcome to a discussion of the television series Rings of Power, specifically my friend AP Canavan and I from A Critical Dragon, by the way, will be discussing episode 1, A Shadow of the Past. And we will begin with a spoiler-free assessment of the episode, and then we will get into the nitty-gritty details. But first, let me welcome AP. How are you today?
I am doing very well, Nemesis.
Mm.
It has been quite some time since been quite some time since we've had a chat. But it's good now that your professional neminosity is clearly being recognized.
Thank you. And thank you for the lovely present, my friend. I mean, Nemesis. So it is great to see you as always. And I'm excited to talk about this show. There's a lot of good things to say about it, I believe. And so I am happy to do so. But I would like first to get your general assessment of the first episode. What are your thoughts? Anything you want to talk about at all in a non-spoilery way, and then I'll follow with my non-spoiler thoughts, and then we can get into the nitty-gritty.
Okay, so to get this out of the way, I really liked it. That does not mean that I don't have quibbles and I don't have things that I wish they'd done differently or things that if I'd been in charge, I would have done. But looking at what was produced, I sat there enthralled for an hour, lost in this world that was being created. And I watched it through once, and then I had intended to rewatch it before we recorded this and forgot and ran out of time. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm doing this off the memory of when I watched it last week.
Oh dear, yeah, I did too. But yeah,
but I really enjoyed it. Now, one of the reasons why I enjoyed it, firstly, it was, and I know a lot of people have talked about this. The visuals were stunning.
yeah,
That what was on the screen, and remember, this is a TV show. And I think people keep forgetting, regardless of the amount of money spent on it, this is a TV show. And the level of quality of what was put on the screen, I went, oh my God, there are major feature films of the last 5 years, blockbusters of the last 5 years that did not look this good. And it's TV, the same TV that, we're going to get more reality TV shows, or we're going to get these. I was just blown away by that. And, but let's face it, in terms of what I deem important, narrative is always far more important to me than the visuals. I just wanted to get that out of the way because it really is visually stunning.
Agreed.
The second thing was I really liked the soundtrack. And it's because the different themes that have been worked into it. There are different themes for the elves, the Harfoots, we see. Well, we're not spoiling anything, but in episode 2, obviously because they both showed at the same time, the dwarves and the men, the humans, that there were different themes for them, and I really liked that. It was these nice signatures attached to each of the races.
Yeah.
And it then created this wonderful sort of sonic backdrop that was accompanying the visual. And so that whole sensory experience I thought was beautifully done. And it was in a register, tone, and style. And this is something that I really appreciated.
Yeah.
The register, tone, and style of this was not the low fantasy, the gritty fantasy, the hard, gnarly, pseudo medieval, dirt under your fingernails kind of fantasy that we've been getting because of the popularity of Game of Thrones that
Right.
people were trying to recreate. They were constantly running back to Game of Thrones as the thing to do because it was so popular. It really created a definitive movement in the visualization of fantasy.
Yep.
And one of the reactions against that, if you remember the Shannara Chronicles, was to go with a very day glow, hyper saturated Disney. It looked very faux. But what we got here was something mythic. And
Yeah.
I think it was what Shannara was kind of going for.
Mm.
But this combination of the visuals was so mythopoetic, if you want to sort of go the Tolkien-esque route of describing these things.
Yeah.
But it's high fantasy, something
Mm.
that we haven't been focused on. And, you and I are both big fans of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is
Right.
which is not going for that mythic, epic, legend feel to it, where it's sort of dripping in antiquity. The Malazan Book of the Fallen is something different. What they put on screen had such a definite style and tone and artistic direction that I went, wow, I didn't realize how much I've been missing this.
Mm.
And obviously, I'm not sold on big action set pieces. That's not the thing that thrills me in watching TV. If people like big battles and duels and all that sort of stuff, all the more power to you. But that's not my personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
I and so seeing this slowly revealed mythic scape where there are all these different moving parts, strong thematic connections between everything, playing through in aspects of symbolism. Not direct allegory, because again, Tolkien famously or infamously detested direct allegory.
Right.
And I think the showrunners really took that on board because there's a lot of resonance and echoing of these things, as well as a a lot of symbolic meaning being attached to things, and a lot of things that are being left unsaid that you have to, as a viewer, infer. And this is exactly the it was almost like this style of show was made specifically for someone like me. It is hitting all of the sort of the things that I wanted. And so those are all massive, massive positives for me.
Yeah.
There were a couple of we can get onto specific quibbles when we talk in the
Spoilers.
spoiler section, but in terms of non-spoiler, there were a couple of things I was slightly disappointed in. In particular, I think I had expected there to be more people on screen. That
Uh-huh.
quite often what we're actually seeing, although it is gorgeous and beautiful, and I think perhaps this is because it was filmed during, and again, a lot of this was filmed during COVID.
Mm.
You can't ignore this as a factor, but we weren't seeing hundreds of elves in the background. There were some elves in the background. We aren't seeing the fields full of men. We're seeing some men. We're not seeing fields full of Harfoots. We're seeing some Harfoots.
Mm.
And because of that, I think that reduces the grandeur of it slightly. And that I that brought it down a little in my estimation. I had been hoping for something like absolutely mind-blowing. And then I realized those expectations are set ridiculously high because again, it's a TV show, not a film.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And so I had to temper that. But yeah, I was slightly disappointed in that aspect. I was also a little bit disappointed in some of the editing, some of the movement. Again, I like long, slow, drawn out stories. I like that time to build up. And while I felt that, in particular, episode one was taking its time,
Yeah.
it did have a tendency to go, oh, we've shown you this scene. Next scene, let's move to this. And you go, but why can't we have a couple of scenes of these people together before moving? And again, that's a personal preference thing. Sometimes it felt it moved on a little too, it was moving between things a little too quickly for me. But when I think back to what Wheel of Time did, with, if you remember the Wheel of Time episode 1, that was frenetic. And I was so pleased that it was almost like they took notes from what didn't work for, idiots like me. What didn't work for me was it was really frenetic in the first episode. And so it did the exact opposite. And I was glad of that. But again, it's a tightrope. You're one bit too way, it's too fast. One bit the other way, it's too slow. And you can't please everyone. But all in all, in those sort of general terms, it was incredibly positive. In terms of it being an adaptation of Tolkien, I actually found there were some things that they did that I thought were inspired. Particularly, without going into spoilers, trying to take really well established, famous characters that are completely solidified in our minds from The Lord of the Rings, be it the book or the animated version or the Peter Jackson action movies. If that is your vision of a lot of these characters like Galadriel and Elrond, that is very difficult to then go, let's go back in time before they are that person.
Yeah.
Because even with the best will in the world, we still have in our head, but that's who they are. And it creates that difficulty. We go, yeah, but of course they were different. We have to see the arc. We have to see how they end up there. And in order to end up there, well, if they were exactly the same now, then that's just boring. Because it's just then, well, there's no arc. They just go through things and are the same. You need difference. And because of that, I think my initial reaction to a lot of the characters, before I warmed to them, I was struck by that they're not the same as the characters from the books.
Right.
They're not doing these things. They're different. And then I went, well, of course they're different. I have to think about this not in direct contrast to not only the source material that they're using, the appendices, and the stuff from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but also they weren't allowed to adapt the Silmarillion, which means some of the stuff that is specifically outlined in the Silmarillion, they were told you're not allowed to use that.
Off limits.
And I think they got very specific, limited permission for a couple of things. One is that very famous shot from the trailers of the two trees. They had to get, I think they had to get explicit permission to do that, because that is a huge part of the Silmarillion, which is the definitive version, and therefore they're not allowed to use it. But the Tolkien estate, because the Tolkien estate was working with them, gave them permission for that shot. And so being able to see things like that, even though they didn't have the rights to it, they still managed, they worked and begged and pleaded to get the things put in. And I'm like, the care and love, clearly, that they have put into this, I think is very visible on the screen. So I deeply appreciated that. They don't have the rights to tell the stories from the Silmarillion or whichever stories that you would pick from the various histories of Middle-earth. Because let's face it, there are lots of different versions, because Tolkien changed his mind about things and rewrote things, and which draft are you going to use? They were very limited in what they could do. But they took, I think, what they had and have created something that is very much in the vein of Tolkien. It is Tolkien-esque. They are trying to create a show that feels like Tolkien when they don't have a definitive story that they can just go, here's the whole thing laid out in dramatic form. We're just going to put it on the screen. They don't have that. And so I am really impressed with what they've done in that respect.
Yeah, they're having to make up a lot along the way. and then give enough nods. And I think it's interesting. You said several things that I'm going to riff off of here, but also maybe add a few things. Visually, of course, I agree with you. It's stunning. It's absolutely stunning and breathtaking in moments. And I love the word that you used, mythic. I think that's the perfect descriptor. It is indeed mythic. What I really appreciate, though they're not able to take direct storylines from the Silmarillion, there is a certain tone in the Silmarillion that is majestic. It is high. It consists of a kind of beauty that is infused at the same time with a very grim kind of atmosphere, and they achieved that very well in the first episode. I felt like, okay, there's the beauty, and there are these little hints that, there are things wrong here. There are things wrong in Middle Earth, and you can tell there's something sinister at work at the same time. So I liked that. I felt that they got the tone pretty. I mean, I felt like the tone was great from that, and that also it was interesting to me how both visually and in terms, you mentioned the music, in terms of the soundtrack, the name Howard Shore does appear in the credits. So of course, Howard Shore did the scores for the Peter Jackson films, The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. And so Howard Shore is involved in this. And I do feel that not only in terms of the music, but also in terms of the visuals. For example, the elvish armor that you see in the Rings of Power, in the prologue part particularly, is also very much like the elvish armor you see in Fellowship of the Ring in the prologue. And I don't think, spoiler.
To be honest, it's probably slightly too close.
Yeah, well, I mean, so I think that's deliberate, though. That's probably deliberate. Okay, is it a coincidence that you have a prologue that is narrated by Galadriel in Fellowship of the Ring, and you have a prologue that is narrated by Galadriel in the first episode of Rings of Power? So I think there are lots of these little nods, and there are ways in which it's maybe a bit dangerous to do, but they are definitely, I think, trying to evoke something of the Peter Jackson films, even as they are striking out on their own and doing something different visually. And Howard Shore isn't just repeating the same music that he wrote for Lord. And I don't know if there's other composers involved.
The main composer of that's just what I was quickly. I could remember his first name. His first name is very memorable because it's Bear. But I couldn't remember his second name, which is McCreary. Bear McCreary has done the soundtrack, and obviously they're using themes from Howard Shore, and Bear McCreary has built on that and designed these new things. So the fact that I know a lot of people venerate the Jackson adaptation, and if the McKean is it McKean and Payne and McKay? Isn't that those are the two showrunners? If they had absolutely ignored and dismissed Peter Jackson's adaptation, I think people would have been very unhappy, because for a lot of people that's
a definitive version of the story.
That's a definitive version. Of course, some of us who are slightly older remember other versions of The Lord of the Rings, and those have had significant impacts on how we think of the visualization.
The animated version, I know you're a fan of that, and I love those too. But
I think if they had dismissed and ignored Peter Jackson stuff, I think that would have been a disappointment to a lot of fans. And the fact that they went, we are not allowed to use Peter Jackson's version. We're not allowed to do those things. But what we'll do is we'll bring those elements that we can nod to. And again, we refer to a lot of this stuff as sort of like Easter eggs or fan service. That exactly as you pointed out, Galadriel giving the introduction, the voiceover at the beginning to bring us up to speed, mimicking the way that Peter Jackson did it.
And they had to be conscious of that. They had to be.
And trying to do things to try to cater to the fans and please the fans and go, yeah, we know this is a beloved franchise. We know these are beloved stories. We want to add to it, but we're not dismissing what came before.
Yeah.
And again, I think when you look at that, you realize the intentionality behind that is to be respectful and reverent and to treat things seriously and to say, yes, we are aware that we are in a long line of people who are building on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yep, and that's a bit of a tightrope, but I think they walked it well.
Yeah,
and it's very difficult to step into the shoes that were worn by Kate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving, but I do think that the acting is solid in this series so far, and that the actors are beginning to put their own stamp on these characters. So I'm very pleased with that, by the way, as well. The acting I thought was great, and there was nobody I felt like, ooh, that's not so good. I felt pretty good about the acting. Like you in the first episode, I did have some issues with the editing, with the fact maybe it's because they're just trying to introduce these various threads, in the first show, and you're just sort of trying to get your head around, okay, this is going to be a thread, and I just have to let myself get to know these characters, and it's going to be okay. Let's go along with it for now. That worked for me, but I thought it was interesting how visually and auditorially there were some deliberate nods to Jackson's versions of the Lord of the Rings, but I do think that there's sufficiently enough stuff that they're doing different to make their own. Plenty of that. So I appreciate that, actually. I thought, like I said, they walked that tightrope pretty well, and I love the tone of it, the mythicness of it, the beauty of it, the grimness of it. It's all there where it should be. And
in fact, on that point, Philip, I think the two words that I would use to describe it is both numinous, which obviously is a very powerful word for describing Tolkien's work.
Yeah,
the numinous is a lot of what he was reaching for,
right?
But also this period of the history of Middle Earth, we know is ending in tragedy. That there is an underlying sinister tone that is creeping in, and so knowing the fate of the world, knowing what's coming. It's the blend of the numinous with the tragic.
Yes.
And there are a lot of Tolkien's Catholicism, I think, is being represented very well in this. There are a lot of the themes and a lot of the parallels where you can see they are building on that aspect of Tolkien's writing.
Yeah.
And I was really appreciative of it. I was surprised to see such attention paid to that. I thought it was beautiful that they had.
Yeah.
But, today's society tends to be a great deal more secular and a great deal more cynical. And therefore, having these elements of that Catholicism built in and treating them with seriousness and, not being flippant or facetious about them.
Right.
I thought it was really nice to see.
And that's where you get the epic or high fantasy atmosphere, I think, as well. And a lot of it derives from there. But another thing that I thought was interesting, and this is where I thought we could discuss this a bit. And I want to present this as neutrally as possible. And of course, there's been all kinds of, we're not going to talk directly about all the stuff people have been saying in terms of representation, or we can if we want, but I thought there was an interesting thing there where they chose to have different accents for different peoples. And you know where I'm going with this, but let me explain first.
Well, before you, I have a whole complex rant about this.
Oh, good.
So, this would be, and the thing is, we didn't talk about this beforehand. This would be the biggest thing that annoys the absolute hell out of me.
Well,
but
and I figured
I appreciate that it is a very, very personal pet peeve of mine.
Well,
And
people
so
will
please
figure out
explain.
why. Yeah, yeah. So in Rings of Power, they have presented and you can there's a logic to it where you would have different peoples with different accents that represent their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is
Mm-hmm.
some of these accents draw on some very old stereotypes
Mm-hmm.
about some of these cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm an American, so I have maybe a slightly less personal, let's say, horse in this race, but
Mm-hmm.
there are no characters with American accents in Rings of Power. But I have enough of an ear for accents to realize that the elves speak with a very sort of posh English accent,
Uh-huh.
whereas the dwarves don't come up in the first episode, but they're Scottish apparently.
Mm-hmm.
And we could talk about that too, but the one where I think we're going to talk the most is the humans seem to have a more sort of rural, rustic English accent,
Mm-hmm.
and the hobbits, or the Harfoots as they're called, the proto-hobbits,
Uh-huh.
Irish accent, or at least an attempt. I don't think any of the actors, you tell me if I'm wrong, but those Irish accents sound like they're not quite authentic, but they're definitely going for a sort of an Irish accent there. You tell me, AP. So this is one thing I wanted to talk with you about, because I could see now. Alas, I am not Irish. I would love to be, but I'm not. But knowing as much as I do about the stereotypes and the oppression and the really negative views of the Irish that have been put out there historically, and I don't think even historically is quite the right word. I think these are still have some stigma to them. So these little hobbits, they're lovable. They're cute, but they're also very rustic, and they're very naive, and they're presented as somewhat bumbling and dirty. They're all smudged and rosy cheeked and all of that. So AP, you're about to burst. So I want to let you talk about this, because as I was watching it, I have to admit, I sort of winced and I thought, I might not have gone with that accent. I might have gone with maybe a more rural English accent, like they did in the Peter Jackson films, the Hobbits, except for Pippin, who has a Scottish accent for some reason, because Billy Boyd is Scottish. In the Lord of the Rings films by Peter Jackson, they don't have an Irish accent. So what do you think of this choice, AP?
Let me first say,
Yeah.
I I understand why, particularly an American company with American writers,
Mm,
and this is a program for a worldwide audience.
right.
When you are picking accents to define culturally defined races or peoples within or cultures within a TV show,
Right.
having a definitive accent works really well. It's a way of, again, providing that oral consistency and
Yeah.
cohesiveness
Yeah.
to representation. So all the elves speaking with one accent,
Right.
a group of humans from an area speaking with one kind of accent, the dwarves having their accent, the dwarven accent, hobbits or harfoots having their accent. I understand that. And as has been, it is a cultural stereotype that quite often, when we want someone to sound very well educated and well bred and upper class, one slips into the English accent. And oh, yes, we'll have an upper class English accent because that is refined. And that is a stereotype that has been propagated for centuries. And you can't just turn on a dime and ignore it.
Right.
And when you hear someone with that very refined upper class English accent, that is, they're noble, they are well educated, they are, that is the thing that immediately sort of kicks in on it. And of course, Hollywood has always played with this because, they might be that, but they're also English and therefore the enemy. And, you know, that was quite often why, for a whole period of time, anyone with an upper-class English accent in an American film was the bad guy.
Right, right, right. The
So
imperialists.
that
Yeah.
is very, very common. I understand that. It is something that is very, very prevalent. Then having, well, what are we going to do for other readily identifiable English accents? And of course, there are accents all over the world.
Yeah.
But because of the Lord of the Rings being associated so strongly with the UK, in particular England,
Yeah.
choosing multiple English accents would not or might not have worked, because while people from this part of the world would readily distinguish between them, people in other parts of the world may not find them distinct enough.
Uh-huh.
But there are a lot of associations and prejudices attached to accents and portrayals of the people with those accents.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a problem that I had with the Wheel of Time adaptation. Because
yeah, as we were watching, I was watching with my family, and my family members were saying, "Oh, those are just like the ones in Wheel of Time, the caravan people." Yeah, so yeah,
and again, the problem I had with them using that accent and it was nothing to do with how the actors were portraying it.
right.
This is not a criticism of the actors. In this, okay, some of the actors have a more Irish, sure and Bagara, you'll never get your hands on me Lucky Charms kind of approach to it.
Oh,
And that faux Irishness,
yeah,
it can be difficult because it is easy to go into caricature. But I don't blame the actors for this. This is a choice that was made.
Right.
For them, and they are doing their best, and in fact they're treating it seriously. And
yes.
you know, that is the most I can ever expect from an actor to take it seriously and not play it up as a silly caricature. I actually respect that.
Yeah.
My problem is the decision to once again make the peasant, dumb, illiterate, food grubbing, itinerant beggars Irish. And
Yeah.
this, I know it is not what is intended.
Right.
But this is such a harmful stereotype that has been propagated for so long, that the dirty, itinerant travelers who sneak into your area and steal your food all have Irish accents. And I am so fed up of this. You have no idea. And particularly when we consider the construction of Tolkien's elves, when you think a lot of the fairy and the elvish representation prior to Tolkien, particularly in English society, were of those Tinkerbell-esque little tiny fairies with wings.
Yeah.
And yet Tolkien went back to the Welsh myths and the Celtic myths, because obviously Irish and Welsh and Breton and Cornish were all Celtic nations that shared this long mythological and legendary history. That Tolkien drew on those to create the elves, who are both beautiful and inhuman, who are in some ways cold and terrible, and yet wonderful and generous, that they're not human. And I was so hoping with this that some aspect of that would have been communicated, that the elves would have been using Irish accents or even Welsh accents to reflect that part of where they came from.
Yeah.
And
well, it's a fact that two Elvish languages that Tolkien invented, of the two, one is based on Finnish, that is the more noble Elvish language of Quenya, and then the Sindarin, though, is based on Welsh. It is based on the sounds of Welsh, so that would be appropriate. Yeah.
And even in the show, they have them rolling their R's, which
Yeah.
is not something that you find in a refined English accent at all.
Right. Right. They tend to lose their R's.
Bunch of R's. But it is something that you find in a lot of the Celtic accents.
Yeah.
And so I understand why, when you're building up the high society of the elves, they have gone for the stereotypical,
Right.
refined English accent. A, it is an accent that a lot of actors find easier to mimic.
Mm-hmm.
B, it plays into that stereotype that we're so used to.
We
And
hear
and I
it
can
and we have
understand that.
all these associations built in already. The problem with built-in associations is sometimes they're not very reflective. So
Um, and I just was disappointed because this was an opportunity. The elves could have been Welsh.
yeah.
And they didn't you didn't have to go for a ridiculous mining Welsh accent. There are refined Welsh accents.
Oh,
To
so
add that
lovely.
element to it, I think would have made it beautiful and sonorous and
Yeah.
given their English a lyricism. And
Mm-hmm.
then you have the humans, and again, the humans working in the field are given it might be West Country accents. It's hard to tell with some
Yeah.
of them, but
Yeah.
again, a kind of working class, and you see the class structure being imposed. The elves on the top, and everyone else beneath them, and yeah, again, that reflects the stratification of hierarchies in Tolkien's world. I understand that,
Yeah.
but I am just so I honestly am fed up with famine Irish pageantry being used as a stereotype for these happy-go-lucky and in all honesty, it is getting more and more offensive as time goes on.
Okay.
I didn't get as offended about this when I was younger, but it's 2022. Can can we not move past this? But the
Yeah.
thing is, the Harfoots are delightful. And
They're cute. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they are a wonderful storyline.
Yeah.
I am so fed up of this. And there were so many different directions they could have gone. And you could have added in New Zealand accents or
Yeah.
specifically Maori accents or Pacific Islanders or Australian or one of the
I think
various
a
accents from
Vermont
the
accent
US.
would be perfect. Vermont accent. Yeah.
But there are a load of different accents in the US. But the
Yeah.
problem is when people see that in a show about a mythic fantasy world, because we associate American accents very much with the modern day,
Yeah.
that causes cognitive dissonance.
Right.
And if your audience is predominantly American, which let's face it, there are a lot more Americans than there are people in Ireland,
Yeah.
that you go, right, let's cater to what is going to be pleasing to the majority of the audience.
Yeah.
And like I do understand it.
Yeah.
But yes, it is a pet peeve. I am sick to my back teeth of this particular representation. I hated it in Wheel of Time, and I hate it in Rings of Power, and I will hate it in every show and film that they will make in the next 20 years where they are going to repeat exactly the same thing because
Yeah.
it's the easy thing to do.
It's ironic too, though, because I think you were alluding earlier to the fact that there is some awareness, some deliberate presentation of a theme of class. You have some resentment on the part of the humans toward the elves, and they've been watching over them. And oh, these humans, they sided with Morgoth, and that was thousands and thousands of years ago. And it's interesting because some of the humans in that situation are presented in a sympathetic light, which we'll talk about when we get to the spoilers. Whereas the elves, and this is straight out of Silmarillion too, some of the elves do suffer from arrogance and they have a sort of short-sightedness. And that's a theme that is all
Yeah,
over the Silmarillion. That pride goeth before the fall,
yeah, and that's why I completely understand why they did it
Yeah.
because it fits with the elves assuming this position of superiority. The
Mm-hmm.
men of Numenor are going to be the closest to them, and then
They'll
you're
have
going to
English
have,
accents. I'm predicting it right now. They're going to have English accents. Yeah.
even though I think ancient Egypt was more a model for a lot of Numenor than England.
Farazan and all that. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
But I'm guessing that, and we don't know yet, but I'm guessing that Numenor is going to be, well, hello, Galadriel, and how are you today? Would you like some tiffin?
Something like that.
Um,
Yeah.
that And it does. It plays with the stratification that Tolkien used. I understand it. The dwarves being Scottish, of course. Like,
Yeah.
Tolkien didn't have the dwarves being Scottish, but that's what we've come to expect of dwarves in fantasy for some
You
unknown
know,
reason.
that started in the Lord of the Rings films, I think, right? With
No, because
Gimli.
it was in the Forgotten Realms, long
Oh,
before it was in um, uh, Peter Jackson stuff. And even
see,
like Bakshi's version does not have Gimli with the Scottish accent. Again, I think a lot of it is trying to localize accents to the UK to
uh,
give the different peoples definitive accents. And they go, yeah, make dwarves Scottish. And
but
also, oh, they
I
all
could
have red
imagine
hair.
though, I could imagine some Scottish people thinking, I don't really appreciate that because dwarves are
Oh,
presented as, as greedy, and they're presented as, drunken, and they're presented as all these, sorry, terrible stereotypes.
alcoholic miners.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh,
yeah,
it's and again, it's you can understand the reason why.
right.
It can fit with the thing, but it's playing into those stereotypes is offensive. It genuinely
Yeah.
is to some people, me included. And I can understand why other people aren't offended by it. I can understand it fits with the rationale. But when you make the grubby, dirty peasants who sneak from place to place and steal the food from farmhouses and just wander around, and then they're, oh, let's all have a dance and a jig in the forest. You're like, oh, go away. Stop making them. And it's not even that they're making them Irish, they're making them Irish. Ooh, how are
Right,
you?
right.
Um, and
Top of the morning, all that. Yeah.
yeah, and again, playing into, oh, the agricultural English people, oh, let's all make them the peasant types, and the noble, powerful elves are going to, because they act as wardens. They are the prison guards, making sure that that population doesn't get it. You can see how it fits, but it is. I apologize that I have ranted about this, but it is genuinely something that I do honestly find insulting and upsetting, because people are like, oh, you're blowing out of all proportion. I can tell you the entire time that I lived and studied in England, that attitude
Yeah.
was prevalent. Oh, you're surprisingly intelligent for someone with your accent.
Yeah.
You're surprisingly articulate for someone with your accent.
Yeah.
That
Well,
and and I'm not saying all English people did this. Of course not.
no.
But it wasn't an inconsiderable number of people initially made assumptions about who I was,
Hmm.
what type of personality I had, whether I was trustworthy, how well educated I was, all based on my accent. And my accent isn't even a Southern Irish accent. I have a Northern Irish accent.
Right. Yeah.
And that didn't make any difference. I was another Paddy. And that's the thing. It is the reduction of an entire people
Yeah.
to a pageant stereotype.
Yep.
And it's offensive. But let's
Yeah. We should move on. I will note that you are taller than a hobbit as well. So,
because I'm taller than you, short ass.
so anyway, moving on to spoilers. After that, I feel like it's time.
Yeah.
And we can talk about more themes along the way. But I do think that is an interesting that there is awareness of the class hierarchy, and that is deliberately presented in the show. I think you can see it right off the bat, even in the first episode. But let's talk spoilers. So are there particular scenes or characters that you would first like us to discuss? Because of course, I think Galadriel is an obvious one,
Yeah.
but
Um, from the first episode, I think Galadriel and Elrond are two characters that I really want to talk about.
okay,
And then the interaction of Arondir and Bronwyn,
yes,
which I love that storyline.
yeah,
I will rein in my temper to talk about the Harfoots, but
Nori.
understand that
Yeah.
I am never going to enjoy that storyline as much as other people because of my reaction to that one particular thing. And I do try to rein it in,
Yeah.
but I think they did a fantastic job. I can see why they're there, but yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Galadriel.
We'll start with Galadriel then. Yeah. Yeah.
First off, I think the actor did a stunning job. When
Agreed.
we think of how Galadriel ends up in The Lord of the Rings as very regal and wise and reserved, and you
Yeah.
go, how does someone become regal, wise, and reserved?
Mm.
Well, usually it's they've started out and they've done things that they have learned very hard lessons from.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And so, starting with Galadriel here, you have the pride, you have the arrogance, and you have the determination, like the self belief and determination,
Yeah.
beautifully, wonderfully portrayed.
Yeah.
And you know that that is going to soften and age into wisdom and command. That
Yeah.
when you see her at the beginning, she is driven, she is single minded,
Right.
she is convinced. And when we see Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings, again, we see that that has softened, that she's learned to pay attention to things.
Right.
And when we think of how Galadriel is portrayed in the Silmarillion, that she was this Amazon, she joined her brothers in battle, that they've taken those elements and they have created this character who is clearly an articulation of that.
Yeah.
And her, the PTSD, I suppose would be the
Yes.
easiest way of describing it.
I
The
mean, we would call it PTSD, and there's the trauma she's personally suffered, but also the trauma of having lost her brother, and they took pains to portray that relationship early. It was very important. It was Finrod, right? Was the brother they chose? Yeah, yeah.
But the the war the wars in the first age leading into the second age, we
Yeah.
know that Galadriel has suffered enormous loss,
Yeah.
and it gives this brilliant hook and direction for her character because she's starting off flawed and broken, and
Yeah.
this
And not entirely likable, but for understandable reasons, right? I mean, she
and that's it.
corrupts
You
you a
see,
bit.
yeah, you see the reactions of her command that
Yeah.
like she is just single-minded,
Right.
and they're going like, for centuries we've done this, we've followed you, we've followed your commands, and
Yeah.
we haven't seen orcs in years. Why are we still going? And one of the things that I find absolutely beautiful, which actually comes up in episode 2, so remind me to come back to this,
Okay.
but you know, they're searching in the north and they find this whole thing, and then the elves just go, you know what, we've had enough.
Yeah,
We're
it's
done.
brilliant how you think at first that they're threatening her, but what they do is they put their swords down, and it's like it's time for peace. We cannot follow where you're going. You're just at a level of obsession here that is just not good. So yeah, I mean, she's not 100% lovable, cuddly character here. She's pretty tough. Yeah.
And when you think about it, when you think of the great warriors and leaders
Yeah.
from myth, from legend,
Mm-hmm.
none of them were lovely, huggable, wonderful. They were, for the most part, bastards.
Yeah.
Achilles was not a nice person. Hector
Driven.
was kind of noble, but well, okay, I like Hector.
But driven. Yeah.
Yeah, but a lot of these great mythological figures they had pride. Galadriel is one aspect of the elven pride, and we see it mirrored in Gil-galad. We see it mirrored in Elrond.
Yep.
We see, because they have to establish pride goes before a fall. And what are we going to see in the second age? The rise of Sauron and this whole thing, because the elves were they were just being smug.
Right.
The fall of Numenor, for God's sake, because of pride. Pride is going to be
Major.
one of the linchpins holding all of this together.
Yep.
And so to get that established, so that we understand that this is a wound that she is carrying.
Yeah.
And Elrond sees it. You have that wonderful exchange where she doesn't want to go back to Valar. She doesn't want to go to Valar and the Undying Lands because she knows she's carrying this in her heart. And Elrond points out to her, but that's where you would finally be healed. Everyone knows that she's wounded. Everyone knows that she is broken.
Mm.
But she is up until then, she has been a tool that the other elves have been willing to use because she has been on this pursuit. And again, we see that coldness of some of the elvish decisions.
Oh yeah, and she is not physically scarred, but somebody who's been through thousands of years of warfare, you might expect to see a few scars. But there's the precedent of Galadriel being just perfection. So I suppose they they didn't feel like they could put scars all over her, but she is also definitely mentally scarred, and that comes through in thousands of years of warfare, right?
But elves physically heal quite well. To see an elf with a big blemish like that would be very strange. They are meant to be. Well, actually, and this is an interesting thing about the portrayal. I'm really glad they didn't make the elves all glowy. Because if you think about when Frodo and Sam meet the elves as they are leaving the Shire,
right?
The elves have this glow around them and the sparkling thing. And you go, like, if that was on screen all the time, it would be a headache.
It would, yeah.
But also, that's because Frodo and Sam are looking at them.
It's their viewpoint. Yeah.
Look at the Council of Elrond. Yeah. Elrond is not surrounded by a glow. Yeah. Galadriel, when we see again Frodo and the other looking at Galadriel, she has an ethereal presence.
Right.
But not for the whole thing. Because that would become distracting and annoying. And so when elves, particularly when elves are talking to each other, we're assuming an elvish perspective. They are not going to see each other with an ethereal glow. They're going to see that as normal.
Yeah.
And so I really like that decision that with that elvish perspective, of course, it's going to seem normal because that is their default norm. Humans are base compared elf to human is like human to orc.
Yeah.
That's why I've never really found a lot of the elven human relationships convincing, because it's a bit like a human going, that's a very pretty orc.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. We're gonna talk about that some and even more, I think, when we discuss episode 2 on your channel, the elvish human liaisons. But back just to another point with Galadriel, I love how they set up her character with that little prologue as well, which she's a little girl, and she makes the little swan ship, which is right out of the Silmarillion. So good job, little nod there. But she makes that little paper ship and it floats and it unfolds, and there's this moment of just this beauty and this sunlight and on the little stream, and it's dazzling, and then suddenly the other kids are throwing rocks at it.
Yeah, because kids are shits.
Yeah, I mean, they are, whatever, they're elves or dwarves or whatever, I guess. So, but, that's a great way of giving us her character and the relationship with the brother, with Finrod, who sees what she's about to do, beat up the kid, who I think is the one who becomes one of her followers, right? I forget what Thondir or something like that. What did they name the one who's with her in the north and finally
disposable elf number 1?
Yeah, I mean, at least he gets a name, but I can't remember what they named him, and I don't know if he's the kid who is the one who initiates the rock throwing or not. But regardless, it's a great moment to foreshadow her character, I think,
particularly because she is apart from the other kids.
Yeah,
and when we look at the story of Galadriel, her pride is always emphasized. She stands apart. She chooses to remain in Middle Earth.
Yeah.
To found her own kingdom because that's what she wants to do.
Yeah.
And she sets herself apart. And it's only because of her refusal of the ring in The Lord of the Rings that she's allowed to go back to the West. Like that's her penance. So like setting that up from the very beginning, that is such beautiful attention to detail and mirroring of an understanding of who Galadriel is as a character.
It was fun too to see her relationship with Elrond. And if you're a Lord of the Rings nerd like us, you know that Galadriel actually is Elrond's mother-in-law. That
Well, becomes.
becomes later on
And
Elrond's
also,
mother.
isn't is it great aunt or there's a familial link as
That is
well?
true as well. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because Elrond is from that same line from the sons of Feanor. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, there's another relationship there too as well. And of course, Elrond is half elven, and that is very subtly alluded to, I think, at one point in the first episode, where you're not actually going to be invited because, and it's not spelled out, but it's like he's kind of like, oh yeah, I get it, because there's a little bit of a little bit of stigma attached to him being half elven.
And,
So
and even that becomes his name, and you're like, yeah, remind me about it every time.
yeah, Elrond half elven.
Um, and I thought it was when they said that you're not invited to the next council because it's for elf lords only.
Yeah.
And you go, because of this focus on the class structure, because of this focus on the stratification, and again on pride, again the elves' pride and mistakes.
Yep.
Because that's what the second age, a lot of the second age is leading to.
Yep.
That one line fits with that so nicely because they can't use a lot of the backstory from the Silmarillion. So how do you work in? How do you drop in for the audience that you know this and you're establishing that one line of dialogue establishes while he holds the position of essentially herald to Gil-galad, the king,
right.
While he is respected, while he is a diplomat, why he is brilliant and smart and intelligent, and he's writing the speeches for the king, that the king looks like, oh, he's just saying these things. And we've seen Elrond was the one that came up with it. And
the speech, where he's mouthing the words as Gil-galad is doing it, and Galadriel notices and kind of like, oh yeah, he wrote the speech. I know.
It's so wonderfully done because it's about that prejudice. And when we think of the prejudice that we see in the Second Age, that stratification of the different societies, it's wonderfully worked in. And I know it's not an exact replica of what we find in Tolkien's works, but the essence of that is there in that scene. It was so well played. I loved that.
I think Tolkien, the person, would have understood very well, because although we think of him as being so English, let's not forget he was a Roman Catholic.
And well, South African for a start.
And South African. He was born in South Africa, at least. And I don't know how much he remembered of it because he was pretty small when they came to England. But he was a Roman Catholic, and that meant pretty much in the time that he grew up, daily persecution in the context of England. So I think he would have understood people like Elrond, who were, were kind of not quite fitting into the norm, right? So I like that touch a lot, and it was subtle, but it was there.
And I also like the fact that Galadriel swans in, and she's quite imperious with Elrond, and Elrond it's like, I ain't taking no shit from you, and he just gives it right back to her, and you can then see that Galadriel is still single-minded. She still does have this pride, but Elrond doesn't back down. And then we have those moments of softness and tenderness between them, where it's like, you're still going to be my friend.
It's a nice relationship that they built.
And that I thought there was genuine chemistry and love, and you could feel the tenderness of that friendship.
Affection.
I thought it was wonderfully evoked.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. We sometimes get very hung up on superficial details being replicated instead of the underlying element of them, which makes them powerful. And you can take slightly different superficial elements that communicate the same concepts, the same aspects. And that relationship so far established between Elrond and Galadriel is not the same as it is in the Legendarium.
No.
But the feelings of affection, trust, a bond between them, that's all there. They've just done it in a slightly different way, and it feels true. And that I genuinely have respect. I think both actors portrayed it so well. I love both of them. I'm really enjoying them.
So we have two other storylines to talk about before we finish, and one is the Harfoots, which it's aside from the one issue which we covered, which we're going to not visit again. Well, we might later, but if we need to. But for now, I'll just say that other than that, and I have to admit, it made me uneasy too. So yeah, it's not just people in Ireland, but other than that, I thought that it was fun to see the proto hobbits and to get sort of an idea, because it's not something that's really known in the lore. That there's a bit of a mystery to, okay, when did the hobbits come in, and from where exactly? And then presenting them as wanderers is kind of fun. And of course, there's something that happens very mysterious at the end of the episode, which is some guy comes down from the skies and crashes into the earth, and Nori, being the main representative of the Harfoots and very curious, stumbles upon or visits this. That's how I believe the episode ends right there, right?
With the mysterious figure lying in the center of the crater, surrounded by fire.
Yeah, and Nori looking in like, whoa, So I liked her character, and I liked the relationship between her and Poppy. It's fun. Yeah.
They are brilliant. I think one of the reasons why the Harfoots are in it, well, first of all, it is actually lore accurate before anyone gets annoyed about this, because it's pointed out that they only entered the histories in the Third Age.
Right.
But that, yes, they existed before, but the elves, who were so snooty,
they didn't pay attention to them.
Didn't pay attention to them, but they were around from the end of the First Age. They've been around since the end of the First Age, because that's when
they're good at hiding. So which is shown in the episode as well.
So I have no problem with Harfoot hobbits being in it, and I'm happy calling them hobbits. They are hobbits. There were different clans of hobbits.
Well, there were three major types: the Fallowhides and the Harfoots and the Stores, and they were described, particularly the Stores and the Harfoots were described as being brown in complexion, and the Fallowhides being a bit fairer, I believe. And so, the Harfoots were hobbits. Yeah.
But I can understand why, as a big element of this TV show, they had to bring in hobbits, because The Lord of the Rings is Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin. These are the reader's view of the world.
Right.
That's the view of this world that we are used to, because we are insignificant compared to these great powers, these races that live for so much longer, that have access to all of this magic. We are the powerless ones. And so choosing that viewpoint, it makes a lot of sense for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And again, in terms of the thematic stuff that Tolkien was exploring about, the least among us can be the most heroic, and that these great wars and great deeds are performed by literally the little people. Because, having served in the military, he knows what it's like to be there and to be one person. And he has seen the valor of his fellow soldiers, no matter where they are from, what level of education or background. So Tolkien deeply understood the importance of the everyday, the ordinary person, and he understood what the ordinary person was capable of. And so that love of life that we get from the hobbits is such a necessary counterpoint to the seriousness of the elves. Oh yes, I'm going to go. Oh, ponder this. Centuries have. Let's go and eat some blackberries. That it is a wonderful counterpoint, and a necessary counterpoint to give it that life, that joie de vivre. That is, I think, is an essential element to the richness of Middle Earth.
To see the way their eyes light up when they find a patch of berries, it's really endearing. Yeah,
it's pure joy, and all of the actors that they have there are another couple of stereotypes, because you have the slightly Harridan style wife. There are again some stereotypes and a bit of laziness coming in, but again that creates an initial impression, which hopefully the writers will start to break down and show more depth to show that it was a snapshot that we leapt to the wrong conclusion. You know, it can, that is a very effective tool in writing. Show someone one image
Yeah.
and then over time chip away at it to show that we had made the snap decision in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
But I thought the Harfoots were a lot of fun. And Sir Lenny Henry, weirdly enough, Sir Lenny Henry lived
Right.
when he was a kid. He lived not very far away from where Tolkien used to live.
Oh, interesting.
So when I think it was when the Lord of the Rings was published,
And he
when the
plays
Lord of the Rings was
Sadok
first published,
Burrows, right? Sadok, the elder Harfoot, right?
yeah, Sir Lenny Henry was a kid in Dudley in the Birmingham area, and of course Tolkien lived in
Oh, yeah.
that general area. So he actually grew up in the area that Tolkien was, you know, drawing a lot of inspiration from.
Sure.
And so to see Lenny Henry in this, and to know that sort of connection between the two, you go that he's in this wonderful world that Tolkien created out of the place that he grew up in, and it's this wonderful sort of aurora boreas of
Yeah.
influence, and so that was wonderful. I greatly enjoyed that.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of joy to that part of the episode, and you do feel already, I felt a little bit of, oh, I hope they're going to be okay, you know, a little bit of fear for these people, because you feel protective toward them at the same time, I guess, because they're little, I guess. But, yeah. Anyway, the other storyline we need to talk about is the one that includes Arondir, who is on the frontier or has been posted at this place where they're overlooking these humans who in the past did side with the enemy, with Morgoth and all of that. And of course, his lover, I think we can just come out and say it seems apparent enough in the first episode. It's not spelled out entirely, but I'm conjecturing, okay, that they're a couple of a sort, that although they have to be secretive about it, Bronwyn is the woman's name. She's a human. One thing interesting about it is that all of the elvish human pairings that happen in Tolkien's writing are always with a female elf and a male human. And it's interesting that they've chosen to reverse that in this case. But it is something that is very much a sort of unspoken scandal, I think, in the village. It's not that, you know, nobody suspects. And Bronwyn does have a child with an unexplained father who has a hairstyle that happens to cover his ears.
But this, a lot of that, I think, is actually more important to discuss in episode
in the
2.
Second episode, but it starts in the first, I think. Yeah.
It starts in the first, but I think it is very well developed in the second. But the one thing I would point out about this particular storyline was the relationship between these Sylvan elves, the wood elves, who are manning the garrison, is that they are prison wardens for this very large open prison. And they have not forgotten that these humans sided with Melkor, with Morgoth.
Right.
And the humans are going, but that happened like over 1,000 years ago. Like, what are you talking about? Why are we still being punished for the... And you have that split, Arondir and the Watchwarden, as they discuss it.
Yeah.
The Watchwarden puts it quite nicely, where he said, you know, you think we're doing this because of who they used to be and what their ancestors did. Yeah. It's because of who they still are. And that, A, the high-handedness of the elves, B, their perspective of time, C, this idea of the sins of the father falling down the bloodlines. Like, all of these things are so bound up in Tolkien's world that although this is an entirely invented storyline, this is pure Tolkien. It's amazing that they managed to create something that feels like it was from the Legendarium, even though it's not.
Right.
And even the relationship, they can't bring in from the Silmarillion the human elven pairings that did exist.
Right.
And so this is a way to bring in that aspect, that tragedy of those relationships.
Yeah.
Because regardless of how they end up, they always are tragic.
Yep.
And that, I think, is important. But then they actually went one step further, and this is something I deeply appreciate. Bronwyn is respected in the community as a healer.
Right.
She is also distrusted in the community as a collaborator.
Yeah.
Now, that is a fascinating and really well done writing point.
Yeah.
That tension between being both respected as a healer because she's the healer, but distrusted because she is a collaborator with their guards.
Yep. Yep.
That is a complex position, and I am so excited to see elements of that play out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And we'll talk about that when we talk about episode 2. So, and that's going to be on your channel, on AP's channel, A Critical Dragon. Anything else that we want to mention from episode 1 before we call it a day here?
Nah.
I think we did pretty well.
Well, it's, in honesty, is this the world's greatest TV program ever made? No.
No.
Is this something that I am deeply enjoying? Hell yes.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's no TV show is ever going to be perfect. But we can always find in a TV show that something that we go, this is perfect for me. And despite my quibbles and criticisms, I genuinely loved and enjoyed this show.
Good. Yeah, I think that summarizes my feelings pretty well too, actually. And I'm speaking, and both of us are, by the way, in case people couldn't tell, we are Tolkien fans. And I think it's fair to say, am probably the more hardcore Tolkien nut of the two of us. But we both grew up on Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. And so, we are invested.
And one of us picked a master's and PhD program entirely because of Tolkien. But obviously, I'm not a real fan.
Well, the only one of us is Dr. Fantasy, though. So, I know you love it. I know you do.
I hate you.
All right, AP. Thank you very
much.
And thank you, everyone. And we will see you over at A Critical Dragon to talk about episode 2. All right, until next time.